What is ego? Sutta references S.N. 44.10, Ananda Sutta, Buddha's silence on self/no self, Vacchagotta, M. N2, Sabbasava Sutta, Thicket of Views, 6 Wrong Questions About Self, S. N. 22.59, Anattalakkhana Sutta, 5 Aggregates, Not Self-Teaching, S. N. 22.95, Phenapindapama Sutta, 5 Similes for the Aggregates, S. N. 5.10, Vajira Sutta, Chariot Simile, S. N. 22.89, Khemaka Sutta, Mana versus Dithi, I am persists after insight, MN 22, Allagadapama Sutta, Raft Simile, even not self must be released. Ego is just the Latin word for I. That's it. First person singular. The most ordinary word in any language. But somewhere between a consulting room in Vienna, a lecture hall in Zürich, and a tree in northern India, that little word became the most misunderstood idea in 3 traditions. A doctor said it saves you, an analyst said it must step aside, and a man who sat very still for a very long time was asked whether it exists at all, and said nothing. Here's what makes this strange. None of them, not Freud, not Jung, not the Buddha, ever said what you think they said, because the word itself was mistranslated, and that mistranslation changed everything. By the end of this, you'll understand what each of them actually meant. More importantly, you'll understand what they meant about you. But first, how does a word go wrong? Act 1. The word that fooled everyone. In 1895, a Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud sat down to describe something every human being experiences: the feeling of being a self, the persistent sense that behind your eyes there is a you navigating the world. He needed a word for it, and he chose the most natural one available: das Ich, the I. In German, this is not technical. It is not clinical. It's the word a child uses. Ich will das. I want that. Ich bin müde. I am tired. Freud chose it deliberately. He wanted his readers, not just doctors, but educated people, artists, anyone willing to look honestly at their own mind, to recognize themselves in the language. He also wrote about das Es, the it, for the forces beneath conscious control, and das Über-Ich, the over-I, for the internalized voice of authority. The I, the it, and the over-I, personal, almost intimate. Then came the translation. In the 1940s, a British analyst named James Strachey began translating Freud's complete works into English, the standard edition, 24 volumes, that would define how the English-speaking world understood psychoanalysis for the next half-century. Strachey faced a choice every translator faces. Do you preserve the feel of the original, or do you make it sound more scientific? He chose science. Das Ich became the ego. Das Es became the id. Das Über-Ich became the superego. Latin and Greek, clinical, precise, and completely stripped of the warmth Freud intended. There's a word Freud used often: Seele. In German, it means soul, not in a religious sense necessarily, but in the sense that matters most, the inner life of a human being. Strachey translated it as mind, and with that single substitution, something shifted. What Freud described as a journey of the soul became a medical procedure of the mind. In 1982, a psychologist named Bruno Bettelheim published a book arguing that Strachey's translation had done something close to unforgivable. It had taken a deeply human project, Freud's invitation to understand your own inner world, and turned it into a set of technical machinery. The Revised Standard Edition, published just recently, acknowledges this problem. But by then, the word ego had already traveled far beyond Freud. Here is where the story gets interesting. In the 1950s and 60s, a school of thought called ego psychology dominated American psychiatry. Their argument: a strong ego is a healthy ego. Ego strength meant resilience, reality testing, the ability to function. In that world, ego was a good word. Then came the counterculture. The 1960s and 70s brought a wave of Eastern thought to the West. Alan Watts on the radio, Ram Dass coming back from India, meditation centers opening in California, and these voices carried a very different message. Ego is the problem. Ego is the illusion that separates you from reality. Ego is what you must destroy to wake up. Notice what happened. The same word, ego, now meant opposite things, depending on who was speaking. To a psychiatrist, ego was what kept you sane. To a spiritual seeker, ego was what kept you asleep. And neither group realized they were using Strachey's mistranslation of a German word that simply meant I. Today, if someone says big ego, you hear arrogance. If someone says ego death, you hear enlightenment. If someone says check your ego, you hear a warning. One word carrying the debris of 3 centuries, 2 languages, and at least 4 cultural revolutions, each one scraping away another layer of the original meaning. So here is the first thing worth knowing. Before we go any further, you do not have a relationship with your ego. You have a relationship with a mistranslated word, and that word has been telling you a story about yourself that none of the 3 people who thought most deeply about it, Freud, Jung, or the Buddha, would recognize. Which raises a question. If the word is wrong, if the map has been mislabeled from the start, then what were they actually pointing at? Freud had an answer, and it is not the one you've heard. Act 2. Freud, the ego that tries to save you. Sigmund Freud did not think the ego was your enemy. He thought it was the only thing standing between you and chaos. To understand why, you have to understand what he thought was underneath it. Freud described a layer of the psyche he called das Es, the it. Not evil, not dark exactly, just raw. The it does not know time. It does not understand contradiction. It does not know that other people exist as anything more than sources of satisfaction or obstacles to it. The it wants what it wants, and it wants it now. Pleasure, relief, discharge. If you have ever been so angry that for one flickering moment you imagined something you would never actually do, that flicker came from the it. If you have ever woken in the middle of the night gripped by a desire so irrational that by morning you could barely remember why it felt so urgent, that was the it speaking in the only language it knows. Now, it has no manners, it has no plan, it is pure force. And out of this force, slowly, through the bruising contact with a world that does not give you what you want, something else develops. Das Ich, the I. The I is not born separate from the it. This is important. Freud is very clear. The I grows out of the it the way a coastline forms where ocean meets land. It is not a different substance. It is what happens when raw drive hits reality and has to negotiate. The I is the part of you that learns to wait, to plan, to say not now, not because wanting is wrong, but because the world will punish you if you grab. Freud gave us an image for this. and it is more honest than almost anything written about the mind before or since. Picture a rider on a horse. The horse is enormous, far more powerful than the person on its back. It wants to run where it wants to run. Now, most people imagine that the rider's job is to control the horse, pull the reins, impose direction, master the animal. Freud says that is not what happens, not really. Most of the time, the rider cannot overpower the horse. The horse is too strong. So what the rider actually does, and Freud is remarkably honest about this, is feel which direction the horse is already pulling, and then gently steer it that way, and then tell himself it was his decision all along. Sit with that for a moment. The rider is not in charge. The rider is managing, negotiating, pretending just enough to maintain the feeling of agency, because without that feeling, the whole system falls apart. That sounds like failure, but Freud says no, that is not failure. That is the I doing its job, not mastering the forces beneath it, but staying on the horse, moment by moment, without being thrown. The I is not the hero of the story. The I is the survivor of the story. And for Freud, that was enough. That was everything. But the horse is not the only problem. The I does not serve one master. It serves three. Below it, the it, demanding satisfaction. Above it, what Freud called the Über-Ich, the over-I, the internalized voice of every authority figure you have ever feared or admired. Your father's disappointment, your mother's worry, your culture's rules about what a good person looks like. The over-I does not negotiate. It does not say perhaps or when you're ready. It says you should be better, and it means it as an accusation. And then outside both of these, reality itself. The world as it actually is. Bills, weather, other people with their own needs. Indifferent to what either the it or the over-I demands. The I sits between all three. Translating. Absorbing blows from every direction. Managing a negotiation where no party is ever fully satisfied. No one thanks the I. No one even notices it working. Until it fails. Until the anxiety breaks through. The compulsion takes over. The facade cracks. Then everyone notices. Then everyone blames the I. Now, here is something that gets lost in the clinical language. And this is where the translation problem matters most. When the I is overwhelmed, when reality hits harder than it can absorb, it does not simply break, it protects. This is where what we call defense mechanisms enters the picture. The term sounds sterile, and thanks to Strachey's translation, it is often taught as if these were technical malfunctions in a machine. But Freud's daughter Anna, who mapped these mechanisms in extraordinary detail in 1936, understood them as something closer to emergency medicine. Defense mechanisms are what the I does when the situation exceeds its capacity to cope. You have used them. Everyone has. When something painful happens and you find yourself suddenly very busy organizing a drawer, cleaning the kitchen, answering emails you have ignored for weeks, that is the I, redirecting your attention away from what it cannot yet process. When someone you love and depend on hurts you, and you find yourself explaining why they didn't really mean it, why it was actually your fault, why the situation is more complicated than it looks. That is the I, choosing a bearable story over an unbearable truth. When a loss is so large, the death of someone, the end of something that defined you, and you simply don't feel it. Not yet, not for days, not for weeks. Your friends worry because you seem too okay. That is not coldness. That is the I holding the door closed until you are strong enough to open it. These are not weaknesses. They are not self-deception in the petty sense. They are emergency measures. the I protecting the whole organism from what it cannot yet face. Sometimes these protections outlive their usefulness. A defense that saved you at 7, say, the ability to disappear inside yourself when the house got loud, may imprison you at 40 when you find yourself unable to stay present with the people you love. That is the work of therapy, not to destroy defenses, but to find which ones you no longer need and gently, very gently, put them down. But the capacity itself, the I's ability to shield you when reality is too much, Freud considered this not a flaw, but a feature. Perhaps the most important feature of all. Let that settle for a moment. The culture tells you ego is arrogant. Ego is selfish. Ego is the obstacle. Freud, the man who put the concept on the modern map, is telling you the opposite. The I is the part of you that absorbs the blows, and without it, you do not become free. You become fragmented. And here is perhaps the most revealing sentence Freud ever wrote. 6 words in German that contain everything he actually believed about what the project of self-understanding is for. Wo es war soll ich werden. Strachey translated this as, where it was, their ego shall be, which sounds like a military campaign, as if the ego should march in and occupy territory held by the id, conquer your instincts, dominate your dark corners, control. But listen to the German again. Wo es war soll ich werden. Where it was, I shall become. Not conquer, not occupy. Become. The word werden in German does not mean to seize. It means to grow into, to unfold. The sentence is not about domination. It is about extension. Extending the reach of self-awareness into the places that were previously dark. Not to control them, to illuminate them. Freud is saying, become yourself, even there, especially there. Read it one more time. Where it was, I shall become. Bettelheim noticed something in that sentence that made him ache for what the English translation had lost. There is something almost spiritual in those words. Not spiritual in the religious sense, spiritual in the sense that the project Freud is describing. Bring the light of awareness into the unconscious, not to destroy what you find, but to know it, is the oldest human project there is. Know thyself. Carved above the oracle at Delphi, whispered in every tradition that takes the interior life seriously, even the parts you would rather not look at, perhaps those parts most of all. So here is where we stand. 3 masters pulling in 3 directions. A rider who is more diplomat than conqueror. Defense mechanisms that are not failures, but emergency protocols. And a vision of human growth that says, you do not defeat the darkness. You become yourself within it. That is what Freud actually meant by ego. Not arrogance, not obstacle, the part of you that holds everything together so that you can keep going. The survivor. But if that is true, if the I is not the villain, if the I is what keeps the whole system from collapse, then why does it still feel sometimes like something is in the way? Why does the rider, even when skilled, even when compassionate, still sense that the horse, the road, and the journey itself are part of something larger than anything the rider can see from the saddle? Carl Jung thought he knew. He started his career as Freud's most brilliant student, his chosen heir, the man Freud once called his crown prince. He agreed with Freud completely on one point. The ego is not the enemy, but he believed Freud had made one critical error, an error so fundamental that it ended their friendship and split psychoanalysis in 2. Freud had mapped the rider with extraordinary precision, but he had mistaken the rider for the whole journey. Act 3, Jung, the ego that must step aside. Carl Gustav Jung did not disagree with Freud about what the ego does. He disagreed about what the ego is for. Freud had described the I as a negotiator, caught between instinct, conscience, and reality, doing its best to keep the whole system from falling apart. Jung accepted this. He had seen it in his own patients, in the psychiatric clinic at Burghölzli in Zürich, where he spent his early career. The ego negotiates, the ego manages, the ego survives, all true. But Jung kept asking a question that Freud, in his view, refused to take seriously. Survives for what? If the ego is a rider, where is the rider going? If the ego is a diplomat, what is the negotiation actually in service of? Freud's answer, ultimately, was adaptation. The ego helps you function in reality. For Jung, that was like saying the purpose of a ship is to not sink. True, but insufficient. There must be a destination. This disagreement cost both men something irreplaceable. Their friendship, which had been intense, intellectually electric, almost father and son in its intimacy, collapsed between 1912 and 1913. The reasons were complex, personal, political, theoretical. But at the core was this. Jung believed there was a center of the psyche that the ego could not see, could not reach, and did not control. And that this center, not the ego, was where meaning came from. Freud considered this mysticism. Jung considered Freud's refusal to look deeper a kind of flinching. So what did Jung see that Freud would not? Start with what Jung agreed on. The ego is the center of consciousness. It is what you mean when you say I, your sense of identity, your continuity, your feeling of being a particular person moving through a particular life. When you wake up in the morning and recognize yourself, that recognition is the ego doing its work. So far, Freud nods. But Jung added something Freud never accepted. Consciousness, Jung said, is not the whole psyche. It is not even most of the psyche. It is the surface. Imagine an island in the ocean, the part above water, what you can see, walk on, build on. That is consciousness. That is where the ego lives. It feels like everything. When you stand on it, you see sky in every direction and solid ground beneath your feet, and it is natural to conclude, this is the world, this is all there is. But beneath the waterline, the island continues. It plunges down into depths you cannot see from the surface. Personal memories you have forgotten, experiences you have repressed, patterns you do not know are shaping your choices. Jung called this the personal unconscious. Freud had mapped much of this territory, and Jung gave him full credit. Then Jung went further. Beneath the personal unconscious, he claimed, there is something else. Something that does not belong to your individual history at all. A layer of the psyche that is shared, not learned, not acquired, but inherited. Patterns of experience so ancient and so universal that they appear in the myths of every culture, the dreams of every individual, the symbols of every religion. Jung called this the collective unconscious, and he said it was vast, incomparably larger than anything the ego could comprehend. The ego, in this picture, is not the center of the psyche. It is the center of the part of the psyche you happen to be aware of, which is like saying you are the mayor of the island, while beneath you, unseen, lies an entire continent. This changes everything. If the ego is the center of the whole psyche, then strengthening the ego is the point. That is more or less what Freud's followers concluded. Ego psychology, ego strength, ego resilience. The goal of therapy, a well-functioning ego. But if the ego is only the center of consciousness, if there is a larger totality that includes both the conscious and the unconscious, both the island and the continent, then the ego is not the end point. It is a starting point. And the real question is not, how do I strengthen my ego, but what is my ego in service of? Jung had a name for that larger totality. He called it the self, capital S, not self as in myself, not the casual word you use when you say, I need to take care of myself. The self, for Jung, is the whole, the complete psyche, conscious and unconscious together, everything you know about yourself and everything you do not. The self is the architect. The ego is the foreman who thinks he is the architect. In 1972, a Jungian analyst named Edward Edinger published a book that mapped the relationship between ego and self across a human lifetime. He called it the ego-self axis, and the pattern he described is worth sitting with. In infancy, there is no separation between ego and self. The baby does not distinguish between I and everything. This is what Jung called participation mystique, a state of original wholeness before consciousness has carved out its territory. The baby is the ocean. There is no island yet. Then slowly the ego forms. It separates from the self. It draws boundaries. I am this, not that. I am here, not there. This is mine, that is yours. Necessary, essential. Without this separation, there is no functioning person. Just a diffuse awareness with no capacity to act in the world. But here is the problem. The ego, having separated, forgets where it came from. It begins to believe it is the whole. Edinger called this inflation, not in the colloquial sense of big ego, but in a precise psychological sense. The ego has inflated to fill the entire psychic space. It has mistaken the island for the world. The opposite is equally dangerous. When the ego loses contact with the self entirely, when it becomes so separate, so isolated, so convinced of its own self-sufficiency that it can no longer hear anything from beneath. Edinger called this alienation, and it shows up not as arrogance, but as emptiness, meaninglessness, the feeling that you are going through the motions of a life that does not feel like yours. Depression, in Jung's framework, is often not a chemical problem. It is an ego that has lost its connection to the self and does not know how to find its way back. Individuation, the word Jung used for the central task of a human life, is neither inflation nor alienation. It is the process by which the ego gradually recognizes the self, enters into relationship with it, and learns to serve it, not to dissolve into it, not to be consumed by it, but to take its proper place, the way a skilled captain serves the ship, not the other way around. Jung wrote a sentence that demolishes a very common misunderstanding. He said, "The individualist is the person who has failed at individuation." This is worth pausing over. Individuation is not finding yourself in the self-help sense. It is not following your bliss or being authentic in the way those phrases are typically used. Individuation is the ego learning that it is not the center, and that this is not a tragedy, it is a relief. Now, there is a twist in Jung's story that matters deeply for where we are heading. Jung was fascinated by Eastern thought. He wrote the foreword to the first major Western edition of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He corresponded with scholars of Zen. He recognized, perhaps more than any other Western psychologist, that the traditions of Asia had been mapping the relationship between ego and something larger than ego for thousands of years before he was born. And yet, he issued a warning, a sharp one, especially in the 1930s and 40s. He said, in effect, the East has techniques for transcending the ego, but the West has not yet done the necessary preliminary work. Western people Jung argued, do not know their own unconscious. They have not made the journey through the personal shadow, the repressed material, the denied impulses, the parts of themselves they cannot face. To leap straight from an uninvestigated ego to ego transcendence, as he saw some Westerners attempting through imported yoga and meditation, was not liberation. It was what he called spiritual bypassing, before that term existed. Or, in his blunter phrasing, yoga on Fifth Avenue is a spiritual fraud. His point was not that Eastern practices are wrong. His point was that sequence matters. You cannot give up what you do not yet possess. You cannot transcend an ego you have never honestly examined. The ego must be built, then known, then placed in its proper relationship to the larger self. And only then can the question of letting go be asked honestly. This warning softened over time. By the late 1930s and into the 1950s, Jung's language about the East became more nuanced, more respectful, less dismissive. He never fully retracted the concern, but he seemed to recognize that the relationship between Western depth psychology and Eastern contemplative traditions was not competition. It was potentially the most important conversation of the century. So here is where Jung leaves us. Freud said the ego is the survivor, the rider on the horse, doing its best. Jung says yes, and the rider needs to look up, because the horse, the road, the landscape, and the destination are all part of something the rider did not design, does not control, and cannot fully see. The ego is real, the ego is necessary, but the ego is not the center. And the most important moment in a life is when the ego discovers this, not as a defeat, but as a homecoming. Freud, the ego saves you. Jung, the ego must learn to serve something larger. Both assume, without question, that the ego exists. They disagree about its role, its importance, its destiny, but not about its reality. It is there. It is real. The argument is about what to do with it. And then there is a wanderer named Vacchagotta, walking through northern India around the 5th century BCE. He finds a man sitting quietly beneath a tree, and he asks the most natural question in the world: does the self exist? The man says nothing. Vacchagotta tries again. Does the self not exist? Silence. Again. Act 4. The Buddha. Don't ask. If ego exists. Vacchagotta was not a fool. He was a wandering ascetic, a professional seeker, you might say, who made it his business to visit the great teachers of his time and ask them hard questions. He had asked other teachers this same question, and they had all given answers. Some said the self is eternal. Some said the self is destroyed at death. Some said it is both. Some said it is neither. Everyone had a position. So when he found the one they called the Buddha, sitting quietly, surrounded by monks, he asked what he always asked. Is there a self? HCSN 44.10. And the Buddha said nothing. Vacchagotta waited. Perhaps the teacher had not heard. He tried the other direction. Is there no self? Nothing. The Buddha sat in silence, not meditating, not ignoring the question, simply not answering. Vacchagotta, after a time, got up and left. Afterward, the Buddha's attendant Ananda, who had been standing nearby and who, one imagines, had been holding his breath, asked the obvious question, "Why didn't you answer?" The Buddha gave 4 reasons, but the one that cuts deepest is this: both answers are wrong. If I say there is a self, Vacchagotta will take that as confirmation of what he already believes, that there is a permanent, unchanging essence inside him that persists through time. That is the error of eternalism. If I say there is no self, he will take that as confirmation that he is nothing, that consciousness is destroyed at death, that nothing matters, that there is no continuity at all. That is the error of annihilationism. Both positions are traps, and the Buddha refused to spring either one. Let that land for a moment. Freud was asked, in effect, "What is the ego?" And he gave a detailed answer. Jung was asked the same question and gave a different detailed answer. The Buddha was asked the most fundamental version of that question, and he said nothing. Not because he didn't know, but because the question itself was the problem. This is not evasion. This is a radically different approach to the entire problem. And to understand it, you need to see what the Buddha said when he did speak about the self, which is quite a lot and far more precise than the silence might suggest. There is a passage in the Pali Canon that the Buddha describes as a thicket of views, a dense, tangled jungle that the mind gets lost in when it asks certain kinds of questions about the self. N2. He lists 6. I have a self. I have no self. By self I perceive self. By self I perceive not self. By not self I perceive self. And notice this, by not self I perceive not self. Every possible combination, every possible position on the question, do I exist? The Buddha calls all 6 wrong view, not just the first, not just the ones that affirm a self, all of them, including I have no self. This is the point where most popular accounts of Buddhism go off the rails. You have heard, probably many times, that Buddhism teaches there is no self, that the ego is an illusion, that you do not exist, the bumper sticker version, the one that shows up in meditation apps and Instagram posts and casual conversation. The Buddha did not say that. What he said is far more interesting. The Pali term is anatta. It is usually translated as no self. But a scholar monk named Thanissaro Bhikkhu, one of the most careful living translators of the Pali Canon, argues that this translation is misleading. Anatta, he says, is not a metaphysical claim. It is not the Buddha standing up and declaring the self does not exist, the way a philosopher might declare God does not exist. Anatta is a strategy, a tool, a practice of disidentification. The difference is enormous. Here is how the strategy works. In one of the earliest recorded teachings, the second discourse the Buddha gave after his awakening, he sits with 5 monks and walks them through what he calls the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Everything you experience, everything you call me, can be sorted into these 5 categories. And for each one, the Buddha asks the same question. Is this permanent? No. Is what is impermanent satisfying? No. Is what is impermanent and unsatisfying worth calling mine? Worth calling I? Worth calling myself? No. SN 22.59. Notice, he does not say these things do not exist. Form exists. You have a body. Feeling exists. You experience pleasure and pain. Consciousness exists. You are aware right now. What the Buddha says is, none of these are you. Not in the way you think. Not as a fixed, permanent, independent entity that owns them and controls them. He gave 5 images to make this vivid. SN 22.95. Look at a clump of foam on a river. That is form. Squeeze it. There is nothing solid inside. Watch a bubble on the surface of water during rain. That is feeling. It appears, it pops, it is gone. See a mirage shimmering on a hot road. That is perception. It looks real from a distance, but when you arrive, there is nothing there. Cut open a banana tree trunk. That is mental formations. Layer after layer, but no core, no heart would. Watch a magician pull a coin from empty air. That is consciousness. It seems to be something, but when you look closely, the something dissolves. 5 processes, all real, in the sense that they happen, they function, they produce effects, but none of them solid, none of them permanent, and none of them you in the way you instinctively feel they are. There is another image, older even than the Buddha's time, but one he used and that later Buddhist thinkers expanded. A chariot, SN 5.10. You see a chariot and you call it chariot, but take it apart. Is the axle the chariot? No. The wheels? No. The frame? No. The seat? No. Put the parts in a pile. Where is the chariot? Gone. But reassemble them, and there it is again. Functional. Real enough to ride in. Real enough to take you somewhere. But not a thing in itself. A process. A pattern. A verb pretending to be a noun. Self works the same way. You are not an illusion. You function. You experience. You choose. But the you that does all this is not a fixed entity hiding behind your eyes. It is a process, assembled fresh in every moment from components that are themselves changing. The chariot is real enough, but if you go looking for the chariot apart from its parts, you will search forever. Now, and this is where the Buddha says something that neither Freud nor Jung could have said, because neither of them had the framework for it. There is the question of what happens after you understand this. You might expect that once you truly grasp anatta, once you see deeply and not just intellectually, that self is a process rather than a thing, the feeling of I would simply vanish. Enlightenment, liberation, the end. It does not work that way. There is a monk named Kemaka who is ill, and the senior monks send a messenger to ask him a doctrinal question. Do you still see a self in the 5 aggregates? Kemaka says no. He does not hold the view that any aggregate is self. The monks are satisfied. He understands the teaching. But Kemaka sends the messenger back with a correction. I do not hold the view that any aggregate is self, but the feeling I am that has not left me. SN 22.89. This distinction is crucial, and it is where the Buddha's psychology becomes breathtakingly precise. There are 2 different things going on. One is ditthi, a belief, a view, an intellectual position. I have a self. That view can be dropped relatively early on the path. A serious practitioner can understand, genuinely, and not just theoretically, that the self is a construction. But beneath the view, there is something deeper. Mana, often translated as conceit, but that English word is misleading. It sounds like arrogance. Mana is subtler than arrogance. It is the pre-conceptual, almost bodily sense of I am, not I am great or I am terrible. Just I am. A hum beneath every experience, a feeling so fundamental that it persists even after the intellectual understanding of not-self is complete. Kemaka gives an image for this. You wash a cloth with detergent. The cloth is clean, the dirt is gone, but the scent of the detergent lingers. You can smell it. It is not the original stain, but it is still there. And it takes time, more washing, more airing, more patience, before even that residue fades. The Buddha taught that this residual I am, mana, is one of the last fetters to dissolve, not first, last. It is there at the beginning of the path. It is still there deep into the path. It only fully releases at the very end, at arahantship, full awakening, which means that the Buddha's own framework acknowledges something remarkable. Even a person of profound realization still carries the feeling of being a self, not the belief. not the view, but the feeling, the scent on the clean cloth. And there is one more thing, perhaps the most radical move in the entire teaching, the raft simile. MN22. The Buddha compares his own teaching to a raft you build to cross a river. Once you reach the other shore, you do not strap the raft to your back and carry it with you. You leave it behind. Even anatta, the teaching of not self itself, is a tool to be used and then released, not a truth to cling to, not an identity to adopt. I am a person who has no self is just another way of building a self. So here is where the Buddha leaves us. Freud said the ego is real and it saves you. Jung said the ego is real, but it is not the center. The Buddha says, you are asking the wrong question. Do not ask whether the ego exists or does not exist. Ask, what happens when you stop building it? What happens when you watch, carefully, precisely, without judgment, the moment-by-moment activity of I-making and my-making, not to reach a conclusion, but to see the construction as it happens, and if you see it clearly enough, the view drops, the construction loosens, but the scent on the cloth, that takes longer, perhaps the whole journey, 3 traditions, 3 maps of the same territory. Freud mapped the rider. Jung mapped the landscape the rider moves through. The Buddha asked, who told you there was a rider? But here is what no one expects. These 3 maps, drawn on different continents, in different centuries, in different languages, share 3 points of contact, 3 places where the lines converge. And these convergences reveal something that none of the 3, working alone, could fully see. Act 5, where 3 rivers meet. 3 traditions, 3 centuries, 3 continents, 3 languages, and yet 3 points where, if you lay the maps on top of each other, the lines converge in ways that none of the 3 authors could have planned. These are not shallow similarities. You can find shallow similarities anywhere. All 3 talk about suffering, or all 3 say ego is a problem. That level of comparison is not worth 40 minutes of your time. What follows are connections that only become visible when you take each tradition seriously on its own terms first, which is what we have just spent 35 minutes doing. The first convergence, the feeling that will not leave. Go back to Kemaka, lying sick in his quarters, sending messages to the senior monks. I do not hold the view that any aggregate is self, but the feeling I am has not left me. SN 22.89. Now go back to Freud. The entire architecture of his psychology rests on a single assumption. The I is necessary. You cannot function without it. You cannot navigate reality, manage your drives, protect yourself from what you cannot yet face without the I. Destroy it and you do not get freedom. You get psychosis. The I persists because it must. Now go back to Jung. Individuation does not end with the ego dissolving into the self. It ends with the ego taking its proper place, smaller, humbler, no longer at the center, but still there, still functioning, still saying I. The ego after individuation is not the ego before individuation, but it is still an ego. It has been transformed, not annihilated. 3 frameworks, 3 different vocabularies, and the same observation. The sense of I is the last thing to change, not the first. Freud says it persists because it is functionally necessary. Jung says it persists but must be repositioned. The Buddha says it persists as mana, a residual hum that fades only at the very end of the path, if it fades at all. This convergence demolishes, quietly but completely, the most popular claim made about all three traditions. The claim you have heard 100 times. Freud, Jung, and the Buddha all agree that the ego is an illusion that must be destroyed. No, none of them said that. Not one. Freud said the ego saves you. Jung said the ego must serve something larger. The Buddha said even the concept of no ego is a trap. The bumper sticker lied. But notice what they do agree on. The feeling of I is deeper than any intellectual understanding. You can know that the self is constructed. You can understand it philosophically, psychologically, experientially. And the feeling persists. Mana, the rider who will not dismount. The island that remains above water. The scent on the clean cloth. That is the first convergence. Not agreement about what to do. Agreement about what they found. The second convergence, the rejection of extremes. The Buddha called it the middle way. Not indulgence, not mortification, not eternalism, not annihilationism, not I have a self, not I have no self. The entire architecture of his teaching rests on the refusal to land on either pole. Freud arrived at something structurally identical from a completely different direction. The ego is a mediator. That is its entire job description. It does not side with the ID. It does not side with the superego. It does not pretend reality is not there. It sits between all three, absorbing the tension, refusing to collapse into any single demand. A healthy ego, in Freud's framework, is precisely one that can hold opposites without being destroyed by them. Jung made the rejection of extremes the centerpiece of his mature thought. He called it the union of opposites, or, in the alchemical language he loved, the coincidentia oppositorum, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. The goal of individuation is not to choose one side, but to hold both, to find the point where opposites stop being contradictions and start being dimensions of a single, larger whole. Inflation is an extreme. Alienation is an extreme. Individuation is the middle. 3 traditions, 3 vocabularies, 1 structural insight. The truth is not at either pole. It is in the capacity to hold the tension between them. The middle way, the mediating ego, the union of opposites. They arrived at the same geometry of wisdom from 3 different starting points, and none of them had read each other's work. The third convergence, learning to watch without grabbing. This one is perhaps the most remarkable, because it concerns not theory, but practice. Method, something you actually do. The Buddha developed a practice called satipatthana, usually translated as mindfulness, or more precisely, the establishing of awareness. The instruction stripped to its essence. Observe what arises in the body, in feelings in the mind, in mental phenomena. Observe it as it is, not as you wish it were. Do not chase what is pleasant. Do not flee what is painful. Do not narrate. Do not judge. Watch, just watch. With a quality of attention that the tradition calls bare. Attention without commentary. 25 centuries later, in a consulting room in Vienna, Freud gave his analysts an instruction that makes you pause when you read it alongside the Buddhist one. He told them to practice what he called evenly suspended attention. Do not seize on any particular detail the patient says. Do not try to remember. Do not analyze in real time. Let everything the patient says arrive with equal weight, hover, float, receive without grasping. A psychoanalyst named Mark Epstein noticed this parallel in 1984 and it has haunted the intersection of these two traditions ever since. Two practices developed independently, separated by millennia and continents, and entirely different purposes, and yet both arrive at the same radical instruction. The deepest form of attention is attention that does not grab. Jung's version is different in form, but identical in principle. He called it active imagination. Sit quietly. Let images arise from the unconscious. Do not direct them. Do not censor them. Do not interpret them. Not yet. Let them unfold on their own terms. Watch, engage, but do not control. The ego participates in active imagination, but it does not lead. It follows. It witnesses. Bare attention. Evenly suspended attention. Active imagination. Three names for the same radical act. Consciousness turning to look at itself without flinching and without grasping. Three traditions discovering independently that the deepest insight comes not from thinking harder, but from watching more honestly. And yet, here is where the convergence reveals its own limit. The three traditions disagree profoundly about what is doing the watching. For Freud, it is the observing ego, a part of the ego that splits off and watches the rest, a capacity for self-reflection that Freud considered one of the ego's highest achievements. The watcher is the I, looking at itself. For Jung, it is the self, or rather, it is the ego in contact with the self. In active imagination, the ego does not generate the images, the self does. The ego watches, responds, engages. The watcher is the ego. The source of what is watched is something larger. For the Buddha, the answer is the most radical of the three. There is no permanent watcher. There is watching, there is awareness. But if you go looking for the one who is aware, if you try to find the observer behind the observation, you find what you found when you looked for the chariot behind the parts. Process, not entity. Awareness without a permanent self who is aware. From the Buddhist perspective, Jung's self, that larger totality, that capital S center of the psyche, is a reification. A very sophisticated, very beautiful reification. But still, taking a process and turning it into a thing. Still building a raft and then worshipping the raft instead of crossing the river. Jung might respond, and the Buddhist no-self is a premature emptying, an attempt to transcend what has not yet been fully met. And Freud might respond to both of them. You can philosophize about the watcher all you want, but without a functioning ego, there is no one capable of watching anything. They would disagree, passionately probably, but they would be disagreeing about the same observation, the same strange, irreducible fact of human experience, that you can watch your own mind, that consciousness can turn and face itself, and that something important happens when it does. Jack Engler, a psychologist who trained in both Buddhist meditation and psychoanalysis, captured the relationship between these traditions in a single sentence that has become for many people the most useful bridge between East and West. You have to be somebody before you can be nobody. Build the ego, Freud. Know the ego's place, Jung. Then, and only then, investigate whether the ego is what you think it is, the Buddha. Not because one tradition is more advanced than the others, but because the human journey may require all three moves, and because skipping one, building without knowing, or knowing without investigating, or investigating without having built, leaves you stranded on someone else's map, in territory you have not actually walked. Closing. Why this channel is called Ego. We started with a word, a Latin word, 2 letters, 1 syllable, I, and we watched that word travel. From Rome to Vienna, where a doctor picked it up and tried to describe the part of you that holds everything together. From Vienna to Zürich, where his most brilliant student said, "Yes, but there is something larger that the eye cannot see." From Europe to a tree in northern India, except of course, the man under the tree was there first, 25 centuries before either of them, sitting with the same question, arriving at an answer so radical that it was not an answer at all. Freud said, "The eye is what saves you. Without it, you fragment. Treat it with respect." Jung said, "The eye is real, but it is not the center. There is a self, larger, deeper, older, and the eye must learn to serve it. That is the work of a lifetime." The Buddha said, "Before you ask whether the eye exists or does not exist, watch how it is built. Watch the eye making happen in real time, moment by moment, breath by breath. And when you see the construction clearly enough, something loosens. Not because you destroyed anything, but because you stopped mistaking the process for a thing." 3 answers. None of them simple. None of them what you expected when you press play. And here is what strikes me most. You might think these 3 traditions are in competition, that one must be right and the other's wrong, that you must choose Freud's ego or Jung's self, or the Buddha's not self and plant your flag. But that is the very kind of thinking all 3 of them warned against. Freud warned against splitting. Jung warned against choosing one pole. The Buddha warned against clinging to views, any view, including his own. What if the question, "What is ego?" is not the kind of question that has a single answer? What if it is the kind of question that has a depth? And the deeper you go, the more the landscape changes. At the surface, a word, a mistranslation, a cultural confusion 3 centuries in the making. One layer down, a mechanism, a survivor, a rider on a horse doing its best not to be thrown. Deeper still, a center that is not the center, an island above an ocean it did not create and cannot fully map. And at the deepest level the Buddha could point to, not a thing at all, a process, an activity, a verb that humanity has been mistaking for a noun since before we had the word for either. This channel is called ego, not because ego is the enemy, not because ego is an illusion, but because who am I is the question that every serious tradition begins with, and none of them has finished answering. Vajragota asked, and the Buddha sat in silence. Perhaps that silence was not a refusal. Perhaps it was an invitation. Sit with the question. Don't rush toward an answer. The question itself, held honestly, without grasping, may be the most valuable thing you own. We are just getting started.